Now, I'm very delighted that I can introduce the 5 representatives of the demonstration projects to each quickly come up in turn and tell you about their individual projects, tell you why you should go and talk to them throughout the day. So we have Professor Colin Snape to talk about the Biochar project, Dr. Chris Pearce to talk about enhanced weathering, Professor Chris Evans will be talking about the GGR Peat project, Professor Ian Bateman about Net Zero Plus, which is about woodland creation and management, and Professor Ian Donnison to talk about biomass crops for GGR. So if I can invite them to each come up in turn, the floor is yours. Ah, sorry.
So I'm not Colin Snape. I'm Rob Brown from the Biochar Demonstrator. And so, yeah, so as we've heard already, there's been a lot of uncertainty around biochar. And so the project is basically going to assess the key development barriers for deploying biochar. And it's a cross-institutional and multi project. So what is biochar? So biochar is essentially formed through the pyrolysis of organic material, mostly plants, so high temperatures and low oxygen. And that locks up all of the carbon dioxide that has been assimilated while the plant's been growing. And so in the right context and at the right loading levels, biochar can be deployed into the soil and can potentially have beneficial plant and soil health as well. So there are 4 main streams to the project. There's the preparation, characterization, and degradations. That's assessing the stability of biochar. There's the deployment to land and field trials. So that's looking at the effect on soil health and plant health. And then the techno-economic assessment and LCA assessment, so looking at the business case. And then last but not least, obviously, the societal engagement as well, so looking at stakeholders' perspectives. And so we have institutions working in England, Wales, and Scotland, and we currently have field trials in England and Wales. And we're looking to expand that over the next year to have whole field trials. And yeah, so this is a very whistle-stop tour, so I do apologize. But if you would like to know more about the Biochar project, then there's a range of us here today. If you want to put your hands up, maybe. So yes, if you'd like to know more about Biochar, then please come and see us during the day. Thank you very much.
I'm Chris Pearce. I'm here on behalf of David Beerling and the rest of our consortia to tell you about the work that we're doing looking at the potential for greenhouse gas removal with UK agriculture via enhanced rock weathering. Now, as Gideon and Mark have already highlighted this morning, enhanced rock weathering is part of the UK's net zero strategy. And a recent study came out just a few weeks ago that indicated it has the potential, when applied to arable crops, to account for up to 45% of the UK's net zero targets by 2050. Now, the work we're doing through this demonstrator project is trying to evaluate that potential, and we're doing that by conducting trials at 3 demonstrator locations using the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology's long-term monitoring plot in Peatland in North Wales, representative of upland grazing catchments. We're also using the Rothamsted's research long-term trial at North Wyke, which is grassland or lowland grazing environments. And we're using Rothamsted's centre in Harpenden, which is indicative of arable crop rotation. And we're running 3 rotations of winter beans, winter wheat, and winter oilseed. At all 3 locations, we're comparing treated catchments with untreated catchments with basalt application rates of up to 40 tonnes per hectare. And we're conducting a series of geochemical, biological, and ecological assessments at those sites to really understand both the viability of greenhouse gas removal and the environmental and associated impacts if present. In addition to that, we're looking at the social and sustainable concepts or scaling potential of enhanced weathering strategy. particularly looking at public perceptions, perceived risks, and any issues associated with the technique, and also its potential to use alternative alkaline materials such as slags and alternative waste, leftover products that could be used instead of mining additional resources. Finally, we're conducting process-based modelling assessments to look at the long-term fate of the weathering products, whether they make it out through rivers into the oceans and what potential impact that could have in terms of alkalinity enhancement. I think that's about it for us, so I'm happy to leave it there. Thank you.
All right, morning everyone. So yeah, I'm here representing the GGR peat project. I'm fairly sure Paul in the poll earlier was a misspelling of peat, which would explain why it did so well. So we are, like all the other projects, we're a consortium of multiple research organisations with lots of partners, as you can see, and a growing list from both, government, NGO, private sector, etc. And I'll just try and explain why peat. Why not peat in a way? It's the most carbon-dense ecosystem on the planet, covers about 10% of the UK's land area. We haven't treated it all that well, in part, through things like drainage. So quite a lot of the carbon that was held in those peatlands is now in the atmosphere and gone. That's the bad news, and that's still ongoing as well, I should say. So there's an emission to mitigate first up, but our thinking is we could do better than that, because effectively what we've done by creating these drained landscapes where the river is up there and the land is down there, we've created a huge empty carbon store, potential carbon store, and it could be huge, and it's quite space efficient as well. And the other advantage of peat is that it can accumulate over millennia, it doesn't saturate, and if you can keep it wet, then it's basically stable. And all you've really got to do in these landscapes to keep them wet is to stop draining them, so it's not, in a way, all that difficult. Although there's a bit of devil in the detail. I should also say that we're linked, very briefly, we're linked to another Bays pilot GGR project, which is managed by James Brown of Lapwing Energy, who's over there, and that's looking at biochar storage as a sort of within these saturated landscapes as well. So in terms of what we're trying to do, this is one of our sites. This is the Upland site in Wales. We're trying to accelerate the natural peat formation process, because although peats can lose carbon very fast, they're quite slow to accumulate it naturally. That's a plot of emissions versus water table. At the moment, we're up at the top of that graph. First thing to do is get down towards that zero line and then see if we can do better through things like essentially agronomic management, accelerated restoration, minimized decomposition, etc. So we're looking at a range of techniques that might allow that to happen, appropriate to the different context of the sites. The other thing that's been the kicker really for peatland restoration and wetlands in general is that there's the link between CO2 and methane. So again, if you look on that graph, you'll see a red line going up as you get the water table towards the surface. That's methane being emitted. And given that methane's a powerful greenhouse gas, that risks cancelling out the carbon benefit, at least in the short term. So we're looking at that. That doesn't have to be the case, we don't think. So we're looking at whether there are ways to do that both in a kind of nature-based solutions context in the uplands using sphagnum, which functions like a methane filter, supporting methanotrophs, or things like modifying the chemical environment within the lowlands, adding biochar to try and suppress emissions. And also, again, like all the other projects, this is only going to work if it's environmentally sustainable, if there's a business model, particularly for the farming sector, that will allow this to happen within that farm landscape. We need to keep producing food and not displace emissions. We need to build markets. We need to think about the whole system benefits, not just the carbon, and also the risks. And ultimately, as has been said, this only starts to appeal as a GGR approach if you can monitor and verify it. So that's something we're also looking at. So I'll leave it there and pass on. I don't know why I'm carrying that, but
Hello, everybody. Very pleased to be here presenting on behalf of the Net Zero Plus team. As you can see, it's a collaboration between the University of Aberdeen, University of Exeter, Forest Research, and the National Trust. So we're facing a very complex and multidimensional challenge in that not only have we got carbon emissions going through the roof, at the same time we've got linked problems such as the biodiversity collapse and the rapid reductions in natural capital. So is it adequate to just say, well, the way to solve all this is just plant some trees? We're trying to look at this as a multi-dimensional problem, and noting that, first of all, we have to get the case right for changing land use. So the science obviously is fundamental, but if we're not going to be able to access the land needed to deliver GGR, then we've got a real problem. So we look at the complexities of the financial case for landowners and farmers, and that defines down a set of feasible future land use options. And then we can begin bringing in the different strategies that you've got, in particular via planting trees, but within that, trying to make sure that we're planting the right trees in the right place, looking not just at short-term storage, but looking at it over its entirety, noting that trees obviously don't last forever, and they will be turned into products, and those products will immediately begin to liberate carbon back into the atmosphere, but at very, very different rates, depending on which tree you chose and what products are produced from that. We then have to relate that to all the other land uses and their own GGR profiles, and note things such as, if we do plant a tree on an area, then it will almost inevitably reduce the food production from that particular area. So we need to be very careful that we're not simply displacing that production into imports, which might be coming from very carbon-intensive agricultural systems in other parts of the world. There's no point us planting trees here and, in effect, contributing to the loss of Amazonia. So net greenhouse gas is obviously a very important element of this. We also, though, are looking at the other, what economists call externalities, all the other consequences of these actions. So, for example, there will be direct consequences for biodiversity. These can be positive or negative depending on what you do. Big impacts on the water environment, quantity, quality, flooding, all these things. We have to bring these into the appraisal, otherwise we'll just continue making incorrect decisions. Obviously, there's a lot of things to look at, and therefore, as part of this, we're developing a decision support system, which actually brings all this information to the fingertips of the decision maker. This is articulated through a set of work packages, which also do things like bring in those working partners in government and private sector. I'll show you here in a sec, but this is the team that's involved in all of that work. Those partners, as you can see, very diverse from the public sector, from the private sector. We've got over 10% of land holdings in the UK involved in the project. If you're interested in more, we're going to be out in the exhibition area. Please do come up and say hello. Thank you very much.
So, good morning. So I'm going to tell you about the PBC for GGR, so perennial biomass crops for bioenergy. So we've already heard about the potential role of bioenergy crops. So here we're interested really in how do we demonstrate the upscaling of feedstocks for GGR, so principally in terms of BECCS, but also potentially in green manufacturing of long-lived manufactured products from biomass. So basically, how can we scale up biomass? So a key component here really is around improving the sort of productivity and performance. So we're already dealing principally with two really fast-growing perennial crops. So miscanthus is a tall grass, and also short rotation coppice as a fast growing tree. So these are perennials. They'll be typically in the ground 10, 20 years plus. These would be, in the case of miscanthus, harvest annually, or willow every second or third year. And importantly, these really do produce large amounts of biomass from very small amounts of, low amounts of input. So typically we may get 30 times as much of energy out as we're putting in within these systems because of, again, really playing to those perennial strengths. But importantly, and within this project, we're really looking at how do we get the establishment phase right, because clearly the more we can get that, so we can prove the performance, then the long-lived, those yields that we get over many decades can really have a big impact. And of course, the more we can do that, the less land we need to produce the same amount of biomass. So these are largely new crops. There are in the region of 12,000 hectares or so, plus now grown in the UK, but it's about demonstrating these crops to a wider group of growers, and also seeing how can they be fitted into the landscape and also within other farming systems. So basically farmers identify their more marginal sites, putting these crops on, and potentially looking at using that as a way of improving soil health in those areas. Importantly, as we've been hearing, we need to be looking at the environmental impacts of doing, particularly if we're doing land use transitions. So we're doing both the sort of very sort of focused measurements, but also the wider field scale environmental impacts of growing these crops. And that also includes in terms of counting the carbon. So clearly there's benefits both potentially on farm from carbon sequestration in the soil. Again, these are perennials, so we're getting potentially carbon inputs into the soil on an annual basis from these crops. And then also the benefit from the utilization of this biomass in BECCS or other approaches if it's construction materials. So we sort of need to understand that. We're looking in our own experiments, but we know that some of these changes take time, and so we're also going back to measurements that we've done in the past, a decade or so ago, and actually going in and looking at those systems. And again, really about what are the varieties, what are the treatments potentially, and might we see other ways of actually increasing that soil carbon sequestration benefit. So clearly, this also requires people very much around farmers making decisions about whether they grow these crops or don't, how that fits into their systems, how that fits into those rural communities. So we have work which is very much looking at how that is integrated, why people are making choices about whether they grow it or not, and so really trying to understand that sort of attitudes to these sort of transitions. And then finally, it's putting all this information together, and also in relation to the downstream utilization, so engaging with those people who are actually involved in the carbon capture and storage end of things. So how do we basically take that data, model it in terms of the crop productivity, the environmental impacts, those social impacts, and then through to actual final utilization. So thank you.